Hello, today is January 30th, and this is the SIG cluster lifecycle regular meeting. I'm just going to burn through agenda items, and feel free to add to the agenda. I propagated some things from last week to talk about, and if there are other items that folks need to talk about, feel free to add them too as well. So most of my feedback is from follow-up from last week. For those who are interested, Lee, who I don't see in the call right now, and I had actually gone through and triaged the 110 list. So the 110 list should be reasonable. There are help wanted items on the 110 list. If folks are interested in engaging, I would probably execute there first if you want to get on the hot seat. Otherwise, there's other help wanted items that we're still triaging through. As I mentioned, Lucas did a ton of work, but it's hard to fill in all the gaps where he was, but I'm trying to be a little more systematic. So when folks come on, they can easily do a set of queries and they can understand the state of the system or where we're at. So right now, the milestone for 110 should be legit. And if there are questions or comments, feel free to add them. And again, we're still continuing to triage the help wanted list. Right now, I'm down to like 70 open items left, which is pretty good from before. We were at like, I don't know, 180 something, as well as all the PRs that were open. So hopefully by the end of next week, we should have the entire backlog groomed to some state of where people can just engage on it. If anyone wants to help with that, what we should probably do is have a listing of bot commands that you can use to help triage it. My only request is that you assign the triage label a priority if you're going to commit to it this milestone, and whether or not you think it's a help wanted item. So I kind of reserve the help wanted to like Robbie, myself, and Ilya. But if you just want to like report something and walk away, that's totally fine too. Are any folks new to this call that are interested in engaging at all?
This is David. I am.
David, where are you from?
I'm in North Carolina, just outside of RTP.
Okay. Yep. So that list that's in the, are you able to see the meeting notes?
Yep, I'm in the doc.
All right, cool. So any of the help wanted items as we go through are feel free to say like, I'm interested in doing this. If we don't have, if you're not a member of the org yet, we'll just make sure that it's triaged, and we'll try. What I might do is assign it to myself and I'll just ping you, or assign it to one of the people that will be like kind of a shepherd or whatever for that.
Oh, perfect.
Work. Yeah. All right. There's a question I had with regards to all this triage work. There was one item that was listed for the 110 milestone that I didn't understand, and I don't know if Robbie's not here. I don't know if other folks had thoughts on it. But it was a separate line item from the kubelet configuration work. It says make Kubedium kubelet drop-in generic, not minor version specific. And I was confused by that. I don't know if anyone had any thoughts there.
We discussed that. I think I recall attempting to explain my interpretation of it. But I think what happens right now is that our Debian or our PM packages will ship different version of that drop-in systemd drop-in file, depending on what version of kubelet they ship. So that file had been changing over time in our packages, and I think they'd like that to be more static.
But doesn't this relate to dynamic kubelet configuration?
I think it does.
Yeah, that was my question. Is like I couldn't separate out how that was different from dynamic kubelet configuration because it was a separate line item, and I just went back and forth on it.
I think it's very much to do with that.
Okay. I do see there are a couple of GKE folks. I know Robbie's not here, but I'm going to poke you, Rodrigo, to ask a question with regards to what. There's a lot of line items that Lucas has with regards to getting automated testing infrastructure in place, and that I always am in the firm belief that in order for it to make it a blocking test, at least for the time being, that somebody needs to own it as part of the default configuration and deployment. And that means that for all intents and purposes, that means GKE is supporting Kubernetes installs by default. Is there a short list that the community could potentially help with regards to helping that effort along?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if Rodrigo heard me or not. We can always come back to that, I think, when Robbie's around. I know that Rob has a list, but I don't know where it is. And I've never seen it publicly of what things are blocking Google from adopting Kubernetes installs by default. So if anyone else has a link to a listing there, that would be super helpful. Because
would it be in the document that was used in the adoption working group? Is that document linked from our meeting notes somewhere?
It's possible. I don't go to all the meetings. There's many SIG cluster lifecycle meetings.
So I'm looking at the top of the document of the SIG cluster lifecycle notes. So there's a key, right? Okay, so that document only has one item in the that matches GKE search, and it's a pretty small one. And I remember Robbie has actually mentioned that somebody from Google has compiled a long list of items. So perhaps we could ping Robbie on that.
I put a note in the doc to follow up with Rob regarding that. I'm not certain what they can all share, but ideally, as we start to get more folks involved and spin up on Help Wanted, we can always prioritize. I honestly would like to DAG flow it, because if you get GKE involved, from the inception point of view, like they will filter a lot of bugs through the system. Otherwise we are set up as a separate test suite, which isn't actually testing all of the bits live, right?
Right.
So that's always been our problem. And I would ideally like to make it first class blocker, and that way other people can also depend upon that functionality as well. So as the adoption group grows, they can also, know that there's enough eyes on this that it's stable, right?
Yeah. I was somehow under impression that GKE folks used a bunch of internal things that were quite Google specific, like the way they run other things. So I was somehow under such impression, but I don't know, maybe wrong. If there's like general fit for kubeadmin in GKE, or they may have fundamentally different view of the world.
It's my understanding that Robbie wants to get some of the cluster API work in place and leverage that. Okay. But I'm not certain. I would like to get a canonical list, because I think we'd happily get folks in the community to execute on those pieces, to get them knocked out. And then that would actually help adoption, I think, a lot. So.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, this is Rodrigo from Google here. And just to, to give you a sense of where we are in terms of cluster API and GKE and kubeadm, I don't have a list, so I think we need to follow up with Robbie on the list of blocker items for kubeadm. We've been working actually on a design, to how to get GKE to adopt the cluster API. So that's been more of the focus than actually the kubeadm part per se. But that's kind of just to share, where we are in terms of, it's more really, speaking to Tim's point that like the cluster API is more than the focus.
Okay. Yeah, I think at least getting a list going would be helpful, because then, if you want to solicit the community, I'm sure people would stand up knowing that the broader implications would be wider adoption and more eyeballs and better test coverage, et cetera. So it's kind of like everybody kind of, lending a hand to build the Amish farm type of thing, right?
Yeah, makes sense.
Yep. The only other item that I had was a request maybe for someone else, if they could update the SIG cluster lifecycle notes to reflect all the different subgroups and meetings that are actually in this meeting. So when people want to find out about SIG cluster lifecycle, the main touch point is through the community repo. And the community repo is actually pretty out of date with some of this stuff, and only shows the main meeting and not the subgroups or anything else like that. So if someone wants to take that on as a PR update to the community repo, that would be highly helpful.
I can open an issue and I'll take the PR for it.
Okay. That's all the agenda items that I had for today. I've spent a copious amount of time burning through backlog items. I don't know if there are other issues that folks wanted to talk about.
I just wanted to bring up, or more question, what's going on with the adoption working group? Looks like we haven't met in a while, and is that still a thing?
I wonder when was the last meeting? Let's have a look.
Looks like October of last year.
Is there, do you have it in front of you, Chris? I haven't opened the document.
No, I'm just reading off the agenda. It says last met October 2017.
And do they have notes for that date where they may have concluded that they're going to put the meeting on hold?
Oh, I see. I see what you're asking now.
If you have it in front of me, I'm still trying to find it.
Okay.
I think I'm back on it. Okay, so they had a short meeting, informal discussion.
It doesn't say anything about tabling it, as far as I can see.
Okay, maybe we can bring this up next week, and if we haven't heard anything, we can put a pause on it.
Yeah, they didn't take too many notes most of the time, really. The last couple of meetings don't have much notes to go with them.
I don't know what this, it probably would behest us to talk with Rob too again when he gets back, because I know he was interfacing with other groups, and I know Lucas will be out for a while. I was not directly engaged in that, so I can't speak to it. But I do know that KubeSpray was looking or had already integrated, and I'm not entirely certain what the state of COPS was, other than Justin would come here periodically, but I don't know what their integration plans were.
Yeah, I don't know either. Mostly just trying to figure out if there's noise anywhere, and if so, slim that down as we're trying to get everything groomed right now.
Okay.
Cool.
I did have questions if folks to fill some agenda items. Ilya, I don't know if you had a chance to look at self-hosting, any of the self-hosting work?
Not yet.
Okay. Lee, did you have a chance to look at any of the etcd stuff at all? I know we talked about it briefly on Monday.
No.
No. Okay. Right, then there's not really much to chat about. If you have a chance to look through the backlog as we continue to groom it, feel free to chime in if you're interested in executing on items, and I'll try to assign you where I can.
Yes. We need to, Tim, I missed the first part of this meeting. Did you action making a milestone for the KubeADM and GA?
I did not yet. I figure I'd wait till Rob is back on that. But I was going to put a separate milestone for GA items and go through the GA list and try to get a canonical set of backlog items that we need to get done in order for us to reach to GA. Part of it is on 110 right now already. Other things are punted out, but I have not done that bit yet. I'm still working through the entire list just to get it curated.
Cool. And then it looks like since Rob is not on this call, you just marked on the agenda to follow up with him about this issue that we were wondering about yesterday.
Yes.
I actually added 2 items to the agenda just now. I had these 2 questions, which are, I guess, the kind of open-ended ones. So I'm not entirely sure what's the status of KubeADM repo split. And there was a discussion on the mailing list regarding Juju bits in /cluster, which is a significant portion of /cluster that is not cube up, right? So I don't know if folks saw the thread. I tried to pick it back up, and one of the Juju folks got back. So it'd be good to not let that slip. And and regarding splitting out the KubeADM code into a separate repo, is that something that we gave up on trying, or?
The standard policy is we don't want to be first. That's the statement that we've made for a long time, was that we would rather have other people pilot, and we will be a happy second or third group to go along with that. I know that Kube Control was possibly going to be one of the first groups to completely split off, but the primary reason behind that is we don't want to own all of the other technical debt that will come along with it. And I don't think anybody does really, but I think somebody's got to bite that bullet. But that's been the standard operating procedure for this SIG as well as several other SIGs. They don't want to be the first group to eat all of the infra and all the other costs that are just going to be associated with splitting out the repo and trying to release the bits and coordinate everything together.
I wonder if we could consider some tricks where perhaps a tiny main wrapper could live in the main repo and most of the code could move into another repo or something of that sort. Has that been discussed, or is that still quite a painful one?
I don't know the details. Chris, do you want to go?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think spanning repos might be possibly introduce more complexity than just moving the repo in general. But my question here was mostly in alignment with what exactly is this technical debt we're concerned about? Is it just infrastructure cost, or is it the cost of actually getting the code up and running again standalone?
I think it's mostly infrastructure and tooling costs to make sure that it's all vetted and in place. And sometimes you don't want to be the first person to find all the bugs because you spend a lot of time just dealing with that. That was, I think, the primary drivers. Again, this is probably a good conversation for Robbie too as well to chime in on. That's my understanding of the history. Joe, I know you were in those conversations too, if you have a hot take on that at all. No?
Maybe we can bring this up next week when Robert's back, but I would be curious if anybody's even tried this. And just to see what a prototype or even a first approach would look like.
We have piloted some of those things. Dims is not on the call, but he had PRs to do some of this, and we rejected those PRs in part because we don't we didn't want to pilot it because the testing infrastructure and tooling wasn't there yet. So we actually punted those PRs off on purpose.
For what it's worth, today it's related to spin up tests in separate repos.
What is the work? Somebody would have to jig that into place, and that's not even there.
Yeah.
Well, I think.
Yeah, go ahead.
I think, well, COPS actually does some testing in different repos, some end-to-end tests and stuff. For me, the big thing is the release stuff, right? Like, starting to look at stuff like the Anago stuff, like making that multi-repo would be a big project. And even doing that when you're not at Google is actually difficult.
Luckily, Jeff Grafton has solved a big part of all the artifacts belong in one repo thing. So the Bazel builds for 110 have all of the artifacts there, including the RPMs and the debs and all of the container bits. So you can actually build everything for Kubernetes within the main repository. That's not how I release yet, because there's still a problem with cross builds in Bazel. So all of this jiggery pokery is there in the main line, but it is not all enabled.
Does that cross clusters?
Does that cross clusters?
Repos, I mean.
Oh, not that I'm aware of, no. It was basically to unify the build and release process.
Right, but I believe right now we're still in the situation where all the release artifacts come out of a single repo, or all the binaries are built out of a single repo.
Not really, actually. Well,
Okay, so which?
So the packages are built from the release repo, where the scripts are located in different places, and
yeah, but the binaries that go into those packages all come from the main repo.
Binaries, yes, but for example, like spec files or Debian control files were located in different repos.
Well,
but there's still issues like, okay, when we do a release branch, now we're going to have to do a release branch across multiple repos. Nobody's actually, started thinking about that process.
We don't actually do that. I had a conversation with the release team, and they don't actually branch SIG release or the release repository.
Yeah, but if we moved something like kubeadmin out, we'd want to do that too.
Yes. Yeah. So there's, again, the logistics. Every time we started asking more and more questions about all the logistics, we always backed away from it because we don't want to be the first people to eat that cost. So we're kind of reinventing the same logic and reasoning we originally had with wanting to be second or third.
I just feel like everybody's going to say that.
Well, it's a legit reason. Like, somebody needs to eat the cost, and it's going to be a non-trivial cost, right?
Joe, are you familiar with any issue that sums up your objections to release infra tooling so we can track it?
Yes, that is a legit thing to do. I will talk with Robert to try to summarize the entire history there. Does that seem reasonable?
This is particularly about kubeadm, correct? And I would say Ops is very happy not to be in that same tar GZ file, right? We are happy to be able to release separately from Kubernetes. So kubeadm may have an easier time of it than kubectl, which is going to have to eat that cost.
Well, I think, right now I believe most people install kubeadmin by installing their OS packages, which also include the kubelet, which are part of the rest of the sort of release bundle and system. And I think if we release kubeadmin out of band with different versions and with time skew, I think that would really confuse people also. I think right now the expectation is that these things are released, right now I think most people see kubeadmin as part of the release.
I'm just saying it is something that COPS is not unhappy about. So you may want to, there are advantages.
So I think a follow-on for this is to enumerate the list and record it, so it's not just tribal knowledge, and get it into an issue for tracking in case folks want to execute on pieces of that. Does that seem reasonable? Great, cool. You had another, the Juju question?
Yeah. Yep.
I
So,
don't-
yeah, Juju question. There's a thread. I followed up on the thread because it died off, and one of the Juju folks got back to us. Yeah, let me just pull up the thread. Summarize that. It's I don't know if anybody else read that this morning or.
I always thought /cluster was deprecated, but
Yeah, apparently Juju stuff is maintained, and I mean I just bumped into an issue. I was kind of surprised, and then I thought they moved it into a separate repo. Turns out they didn't. There's some strange situation now. Moving out of cluster. So George proposed something ages ago, and the last email on the thread before I picked it up was from Ryan, who proposed, who created another org, it seems, and Kubernetes providers, and sounds like that's a non-starter now. Yeah. So they're saying that we have to continue discussing this. They had everything lined up before they wanted to use Kubernetes/charms, which is, I'd say, confusing because there are charts and there are only 2 characters that are different in charms, and Juju charms would make more sense. But besides that, it seems like people didn't want to create Kubernetes/Juju something repo.
there's an ongoing question about like where SIGs want to host things and whether or not they should, or whether or not there's an associated repository. This is a larger steering committee question, and I know that there will probably be a proposal pushed out for feedback soonish, and I think we're going to talk about it tomorrow. I think so. So there needs to be a landing page or a landing location for some of this stuff that people are okay with, that lives in a community, either a community home, or they can maintain with sort of the notion that it has the blessing of the CNCF of some kind, right? So that way people can contribute without having to feel like they need to buy into some other CLA or some other process. And that's the typical barrier that most people we've identified. And that doesn't mean that it applies to everybody. But I don't think it belongs in the main Kubernetes repo, and I don't think it belongs in the main Kubernetes org. That's my take on it, though.
So is it like a contrib org that we need?
Well, the one thing that people have discussed, I'll give a little bit of information, is that they've thought about having a hierarchical structure, which includes SIGs having an organizational ownership. So that way SIG cluster Lifecycle could have many repos under its umbrella, right? Where Juju charms could be one of them, and then people can coordinate with that stuff. And then policy, however we want to dictate that, could be determined by the SIG. Higher level policy that would apply to the main Kubernetes org might be much more strict than what would apply to SIG level organizational structure.
Okay, and that's something we can do with GitHub, or is that going to be somehow?
No, well, people need to. This is all in theory. None of this has gotten the blessing of the steering committee and community yet. So we're still in talking about it. But this is the hypothetical of where things could eventually go. Yeah.
For what it's worth, SIG testing is already using its own organization, GitHub organization for stuff.
Yeah, yes, we are piloting some of that stuff just to unblock some other folks who don't really care where the code lives. But I know that some people will have very strong opinions about where things should live and why. And we want to make sure we're judicious and thoughtful about how we roll this out. So they're piloting some ideas and giving feedback, and I'm sure there's probably be an iterative feedback loop as part of this. But again, I don't take my word as gospel. It's only these are the beginnings of things. And I think over time it'll be shaped more by feedback from everyone else too. If that's fair.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not entirely sure that is so much to do with contributor agreements and such things. It seems a bit more to do with marketing than anything.
Well, yeah, there's several aspects. There's contributions. This is kind of treading into other areas, not just SIG cluster lifecycle related, but it treads into marketing aspects. It treads into what is considered blessed by the community, right? And we want to make sure that we're judicious and mindful. Do you have any other comments, Joe? I'm trying to tap dance around this as judiciously as I can.
Well, so Brendan has a proposal out there. I think the general thinking is that 3 levels of projects. There's projects that don't have to be, what does he call them, associated projects or something like that, where it's like they get to use the CNCF CLA, they get other build tooling, so they get a lot of the process and it sort of smooths the way, but there's no implied endorsement or approval going on there. So this is pretty much like, as long as you're not sort of violating the code of conduct, go for it. The next level would be SIG sponsored, where it's up to the SIG to actually decide how to do this stuff. And then the final level is core stuff. Now this would be applied to new repos moving forward. The SIG sponsored stuff would be like sub projects. So I think a good example would be, say, like the rescheduler or the descheduler or whatever it's called this week out of SIG scheduling, or the node problem detector out of SIG node, right? So those are things that are sort of super closely associated with the project, but are sort of built on a different release cycle, and sort of, over time, maybe those things get more official and may migrate back into the core Kubernetes organization, but there's no guarantee around that or explicit timeline. The questions around sort of which organization this shows up into, whether each SIG gets their own org, or whether the sub repos have sort of a specific name that includes the SIG name in the name of the repo. I think, well, that's still, I think, up in the air a little bit. The argument against the org is that org sprawl is just more stuff to deal with, and especially as we start looking to attach bots and sort of get the CLA bot and all that stuff going up, that just getting that tooling done ends up being a real pain in the butt. So that's something that I think is, the lack of tooling ends up slowing a lot of this stuff down.
Okay.
I just repeated a lot of the stuff that Tim said.
Yeah. So it seems like, if you were to put something in a GitHub / Kubernetes SIG cluster lifecycle / my cool project, your whole project's name sort of, under the shadow of this boring name of the organization. There's a bit of a marketing problem there, so it doesn't play nicely with that. I can see how this becomes really, really difficult thing.
But I think the idea is that we want to make it clear that the endorsement is coming from the SIG, not from sort of all of Kubernetes. And so there's definitely different levels of endorsement and community involvement that goes along with that. And this is part of just sort of really empowering SIGs to actually sort of own their own destiny around this stuff.
Interesting. Yeah. Anyway, okay. So this is much more complex discussion. So yeah. Yeah, and and speaking of that, the how does the cluster directory deprecation thing is actually enforced? People just try to not put anything new in there, or
that's the general rule of thumb that we've been following, is like no new code goes into cluster, and to say that it's end of life. And I do know that we've been pretty judicious about doing that, except for things that are GKE specific, right? Where that people really depend upon that stuff. Were you going to say something, Alexander? It looked like you were reaching to say something. No? Okay.
And we can't just try and move cluster into a repo called Kubernetes legacy scripts or something like that.
We could, but we definitely want buy-in from the Google side because they depended upon it the most, right? Like all the testing jiggery, like all of testing depends upon that stuff for standing up the clusters. So this goes back to the original conversation. How can we get kubeadm to be a default testing deployment for Google, so that we get this virtuous cycle and we kind of deprecate some of this other stuff. So there's a grand plan there, but I think it's really slow moving. It just takes a long time because there's a lot of parts, right?
Yeah. Just I think we shouldn't forget those things. I mean, I just find it very difficult to deal with bits and let's say like searching for issues. Everything references kubeadm one way or another. We have a repo of our own with some other issues, but that doesn't actually help that much because people file issues on the other one.
Well, one of the things that Lucas did, and the reason I sent you the people who were on this list earlier, I think it was, I'll go back in the notes. I asked for a group of people who are interested in triaging and of the main repo. And one of the things that Lucas did, he was very upfront about saying you should file this issue in the kubeadm repo. So he had some watch bot or something like that, which did like, checks to see if anyone filed anything kubeadm specific, he would close those issues down and try to, tell them, you should open the issues here. And any legacy stuff he kind of filtered out. So I put that list and those queries into the main, into the SIG cluster lifecycle Slack, and I'm hoping other folks can help to triage that bit. I've been focusing my efforts on PRs and the actual kubeadm repo items to get them all sorted through. So the PRs are good, and at least they were good as of last week. I need to do another bout this week. And then the issues for the kubeadm repo, I will hopefully have them done by the end of this week, and that will be like 200 issues all sorted.
Yeah. I mean, I've been trying to get the grip of PRs on issues, but it just sort of been a little difficult, and I often end up on just a random PR rather than anything that is more specific to this SIG. And it seems like, it's actually kind of related, but yeah. But I mean, that's probably just part of the process for me to get used to looking through them and find my ways around. Anyway, yeah. So cool. All right. Well, we exhausted those two topics.
Are there any more topics that folks wanted to discuss? Going once, twice, 3 times, right? The only meta topic I have for the group as we depart is that there are a couple of folks who I don't know what time zone they're working at. I think they're Asian, that we're definitely working with Lucas with regards to execution. If someone could poke me on Slack with how Lucas interfaced with those folks, that would be super helpful, because there are a couple of PRs that are important that we need to get in and done. And I just want to make sure we have a line of communication, a line of sight for execution, so that way they know I can help them out and their PRs aren't bit routing or whatnot. So if you have information, please poke me on Slack, and I'll try to find and coordinate with those folks. Other than that, thanks everybody.
Thank you. Bye.